Chapter 4. Taking the Habit. During the time that I was trying to convince myself to become a nun, I managed to convince my brother Antonio to become a monk. We were in agreement that the world is nothing but an illusion. We decided to take a trip to visit my friend Juana at the Incarnation, and we arranged to meet very early one morning and set out on our journey. I had already surrendered to entering any convent in which I could best serve God. Finally, the scale had tipped, and I was more interested in the good of my soul than in being comfortable. But my primary concern was for my father. I wanted so much for him to approve of my decision, and he didn't. I remember that when I left my father's house that day, my distress was so intense that I believed it couldn't be greater if I were actually dying. I still really believe this. It felt like every bone in my body was being wrenched apart. Since my love of God did not compare to the intensity of my love for my family, the strain on my heart was almost more than I could bear. Nothing I could tell myself was enough to keep me on course. I was going to require divine assistance, which I did receive. The Lord gave me the fortitude to fight against myself, and I was able to follow through with my plan. The moment I took the habit, the Beloved demonstrated to me the great rewards He grants to those who wage war against their small selves in service to Him. But my inner battles were invisible to everyone else. No one guessed that my taking vows was motivated by anything less than pure desire. As it turned out, entering this new life filled me with a joy so complete that it has never left me. God transmuted the aridity of my soul into the deepest tenderness. Everything about the religious life delighted me. I would be perfectly content merely sweeping the floors. All of a sudden, it would occur to me that the time I was spending on these simple tasks was the same time I used to waste indulging and decorating myself. When I realized that I was now free of these things, a new wave of joy rose in my heart. I was shocked by its intensity and could not imagine where it came from. All I have to do is remember moments like these, and I realize that there is nothing, no matter how difficult, that I would hesitate to do for my Beloved if it were put before me. Experience has shown me that if I bolster my determination for His sake alone, He will bless me, not with increased certainty, but with deeper doubt. Then, when I achieve my goal, the reward is all the sweeter. Not in the world to come, but in this very lifetime. Only those who have tasted these joys can understand what I mean. I have had many such experiences. Some involved very serious matters, and so if I were asked for my advice, I would say this. If a worthy inspiration arises in you, never hesitate to manifest it. Do not let fear rule your actions. If you give yourself over to God and practice detachment, there is no reason to be afraid that things won't turn out. God is all-powerful. May He be blessed forever. Amen. Enough. Oh, supreme good. Oh, my refuge. All the blessings you have given me up till now should be enough for me. After all, your mercy and your magnificence have guided me through so many winding paths to this place of safety. I am surrounded by those who live only to serve you, who inspire me to grow in greater service to you. When I remember the profound determination with which I made my vows and the sweet satisfaction I felt when I gave myself to you, my Beloved, in holy matrimony, I can barely go on. I cannot speak of this without crying. And my tears should be tears of blood. My heart should shatter. Even that would not be enough to demonstrate the sorrow I feel for the terrible ways I have treated you since that day so long ago. Now I think that maybe I was right to have resisted such an honor, since I have taken it for granted so badly. But you, my Beloved, were willing to wait almost 20 years for me, during which time I made poor use of your many blessings, because you knew that eventually I would come around. It seems as if I made a point of breaking every promise I made to you, although that was never my conscious intention. Actually, when I look back on all this, I have no idea what my intentions were. All it does is prove the difference between your nature and mine, my spouse. My only solace in the face of this shame is the knowledge that I have served as a living example to the multitudes of your tender mercies. I can't think of anyone to better illustrate the radiance of your compassion than myself, I who buried the blessings you had begun to give to me under the shroud of my bad deeds. Oh, my Creator, it would be useless for me to try to make excuses. I have no one but myself to blame. I could never repay you even a fraction of the boundless love you have shown me. Maybe if I had tried, my effort would have remedied this broken situation. But I did not deserve a remedy, nor have I been lucky enough to receive one. And so, my beloved, may you take mercy on me now. My new life brought many changes, including in my diet, which affected my health. Although I was exceedingly happy, this was not enough to cure me. I kept fainting all the time, and the frequent pains in my heart alarmed everyone who witnessed them. I spent my entire first year at the Incarnation suffering from innumerable mysterious ailments. At least my poor health did not leave me with much energy left over to offend God. I began to spend more time unconscious than awake. My condition grew so serious that my father was absolutely determined to find me a cure. Our local doctors were out of ideas, and so my father arranged to take me to a healer who lived in my sister's village and had a reputation for successfully treating difficult diseases. The Incarnation was not cloistered, so Juana, who was senior nun there, was able to accompany me to Maria's house, where I was to stay during my course of treatment. The healing was supposed to begin in early summer, but I left the Incarnation to go to my sister's in late fall so that I would not have to keep coming and going. During the year that I was there, I spent 3 months undergoing treatments so drastic that they nearly killed me. I don't know how I survived. Actually, my constitution took such a beating from these so-called cures that their effects did permanent damage, as you will see. On the way to my sister's village, we stopped in to see my Uncle Pedro. He gave me a copy of The Third Spiritual Alphabet by Francisco de Osuna. This book is all about the prayer of recollection. In the past year, I had realized what harm my appetite for romance novels had done to my soul, and I had begun to develop a tremendous appreciation for spiritual books. Since I did not know a thing about the practice of contemplative prayer or how to go about recollecting my senses and my thoughts, I was thrilled to find a book that told me exactly what to do. I set out on the path of contemplation with all my might. By now, God had begun to give me the gift of tears, and I would spend hours in solitude, reading and crying. I went to confession frequently. With only my book to guide me, I did the best I could. I couldn't find a spiritual master who understood me, though I spent the next 20 years searching for one. This lack of guidance hurt me. I was constantly backsliding and almost lost my way completely. It would have been helpful if there had been someone who could have at least prevented me from offending God. During these 9 months of isolation, His Majesty began to bless me with so many spiritual gifts that I managed to navigate my soul to safety, though not as skillfully as I thought I should. My book indicated that by this point in my practice of prayer, I ought to have gone beyond any opportunity for missing the mark. But it seemed to me that this degree of consciousness was impossible. I was especially reluctant to commit grave errors during this period. Oh, if only I had always been so mindful. But I was careless about avoiding minor transgressions, and this complacency is what ruined me. Still, the Beloved was so generous to me along my way that He actually led me to the prayer of quiet. Once, I even entered the prayer of union. At the time, I had no idea what either of these states meant or how deeply I should cherish them. If I had understood these blessings, it would have done me a great deal more good. It's true that my experience of union may not have lasted any longer than it takes to recite a single Ave Maria, but the effects were so powerful and lingered for so long that I was convinced that I had succeeded in rising above the world altogether, even though I was barely 20 years old. I remember pitying those who were still attached to earthly things, even things that were righteous. When I was in prayer, I would try to keep Jesus Christ our Lord and our good present within me. I would think about a scene in his life and then try to picture it with my mind's eye. But what I liked best was to read good books. This is because God did not give me much talent for figuring things out with my intellect or making good use of my imagination. In fact, my imagination was so clumsy that no matter how hard I tried to meditate on the Lord's humanity, I could never quite succeed. Some people try to harness this conceptual emptiness as a way of attaining the contemplative state. Maybe if they persevere in this practice, they get there quicker. But it's an arduous and painful path. If the will has nothing to occupy it and the heart has no object to engage it, the soul is left with neither support nor motivation. Her solitude and aridity are excruciating, and her thoughts fall into utter turmoil. People with this sort of disposition need to have a purer conscience than those who are capable of working things out conceptually. A person who ponders the nature of the world and reflects on how much he owes to the one who loves him, who suffered for his sake, will find himself equipped with the tools he needs to defend himself against his own dangerous thoughts and to avoid occasions for error. A person who is incapable of formulating concepts in prayer is at much higher risk and should compensate for this by reading more, since he has no other source of guidance. The non-conceptual path is so harrowing that any spiritual director who compels a person to practice contemplative prayer and yet forbids such a person to support himself by reading is placing him in great peril. Even just a small amount of reading will help substitute for the mental prayer he can't seem to practice. Good books are an aid in recollection. What I mean is that if a person is incapable of engaging his intellect or imagination in prayer and is not allowed to read holy books, he will be unable to sustain his practice for very long and will probably endanger his very health and well-being. Looking back, I can see that it was a blessing that God did not send me a spiritual teacher during that time. If he had, I don't think I would have been willing to endure this internal aridity and this inability to meditate for 18 years. During all that time, I never dared to sit down to pray unless I had a book close at hand. My soul was as terrified of praying without a book as it would have been if thrown unarmed into a raging battlefield. Books were my companions, my consolation, my shield against the explosion of thoughts. If I didn't have a book, I would suffer from terrible aridity. The minute I find myself without something to read, my soul would become immediately agitated and my mind would start to wander. But as soon as I started reading, the words acted like bait to lure my soul, and my thoughts began to collect themselves again. Sometimes it was enough just to know that I had a book beside me. I didn't even have to open it. Sometimes I read just a little, sometimes a lot, depending on the mercy of God. It seems to me that as long as I could be alone with my books in those days, there was no danger of being deprived of that blessing. Actually, by the grace of God, I would probably have done just as well with the guidance of an actual teacher or some other person who could have advised me about how to flee from opportunities for error and, if I stumbled into them, how to get back out. In those days, if the spirit of evil had attacked me head-on, I believe I would never have missed the mark again. As it is, the spirit of evil was so subtle, and I was so weak that my loftiest resolutions did me almost no good. Later, as I began to dedicate myself to serving God, He rewarded me for this same determination with the patience I needed to endure serious illnesses. Again and again, I find myself in awe of God's great goodness. Again and again, my soul has rejoiced in His magnificence and His mercy. May He be blessed for everything. I have clearly seen that He has never failed to reward me, even in this lifetime, for any of my good intentions. No matter how flawed or how feeble my deeds may have been, this beloved of mine has taken them and perfected them, polishing and giving them worth. The minute I commit any errors, He hides them. Even if someone does witness my transgressions, His Majesty renders that person blind and wipes her memories clean. He sugarcoats my imperfections and makes some small virtue of mine, which He Himself gave to me in the first place, practically forcing me to accept, absolutely resplendent. I'd like to get back to what I have been ordered to do, but first, I must mention again that I lack the intelligence to offer any accurate description of how my beloved handled me in those days. I forget to reflect on what I owe Him. I forget to acknowledge my own ingratitude and weakness. May He be forever blessed, who has put up with me for so long. Amen. Chapter 5. Illness and Patience. I forgot to mention that during the year of my monastic initiation, I suffered terrible anxiety about insignificant incidents. For instance, people would often blame me for things that were not my fault. I did not handle this well. In fact, it caused me deep distress. The only reason I was able to endure being unjustly accused was because I was generally so happy being a nun. Sometimes the others would catch me praying alone and weeping over my sins. They would jump to the conclusion that I was discontented, and they would say so. This was not true. I loved everything about religious life. I craved admiration, and I could not bear to be misunderstood. I was meticulous about everything I did, and I considered this to be a virtuous trait. Not that my impeccable behavior should have gotten me off the hook. Believe me, I knew how to find something to please me in any situation. Nor is ignorance any excuse for my shortcomings. It is true that the incarnation was not exactly strict. I suppose I could place some of the blame on that. But being flawed, I had a tendency to go after what I knew to be bad and neglect what was good. There was a nun in our community at the time who was suffering from a very serious and agonizing ailment. Intestinal obstructions had created open sores in her stomach. She couldn't keep any food down. Her health rapidly deteriorated, and soon she was dead. I noticed that the other sisters were terrified of this disease, but I found myself envying the nun's incredible patience. I begged God to send me whatever illness He chose, as long as it would instill that kind of patience in me. I don't think I was afraid of being sick. I was so hungry for heavenly blessings that I was willing to obtain them by any means necessary. It surprises me to recall this. Although I had not yet fallen as deeply in love with God as I have since I embarked on a life of prayer, there was enough light for me to see that temporary things are trivial and pass away. Somehow I knew that the blessings that come from letting these things go last forever. His Majesty was listening to me. Less than 2 years later, I became seriously ill. It was not the same disease that had killed the nun, but I believe it was just as painful and difficult to bear. I will now tell you about something that happened during the 3-year period I was suffering from this illness. As I said, I stayed with my sister while I was waiting for my treatment to begin. When the time came, my father, my sister, and my friend Juana, with the utmost care and concern for my comfort, took me away. Juana was that nun who had accompanied me when I first left the convent and stayed by my side because she loved me so much. It was during this time that the spirit of evil began to really agitate my soul. But, as you will see, God turned the whole thing into a great blessing. There was a young priest who lived in the village where I went for my treatment. He was from a good family and was an extremely intelligent man. He was well educated, but not overly so. I began to go to him for confession. Men of learning have always attracted me, But half-learned men have done great harm to my soul. I never seem to find any men who are as learned as I would like them to be. Experience has taught me that men with no knowledge at all are less dangerous than those with only a little. If they lead virtuous and holy lives, they are better off not knowing anything. Such men are not inclined to trust themselves, nor would I trust them myself, until they have checked in with men of real learning. A real man of learning has never led me astray. Not that the half-learned men meant to deceive me, they simply didn't know any better. But I thought they did, and that my only obligation was to believe them. They spoke ambiguously and gave me no boundaries. Of course, I see now that if they had been strict with me, I would have just ignored them and looked for others who told me what I wanted to hear. That's how wicked I am. These spiritual teachers would tell me that my minor sins were no sins at all, and that my major ones were only minor. This did me such harm that I feel compelled to take this opportunity to warn other seekers to avoid such relationships. But I had no excuse before God. I was well aware that I was doing things that were wrong, and this knowledge alone should have been sufficient to keep me from doing them. I believe that God allowed these men to misguide me and lead me astray as a consequence of my own transgressions. I, in turn, led many others astray, repeating what my teachers had told me. I blundered through this blindness for more than 17 years until a Dominican friar named Vicente Barron disabused me of my illusions. Father Vicente was an extremely learned man. He and certain Jesuit priests scared me by convincing me that I was building my life on seriously faulty principles. I'll say more about this later. When I started making my confessions to that priest I mentioned, he developed an extreme affection for me. Maybe this is because ever since I had become a nun, I had very little to repent, especially in comparison with what I had later. It's not that there was really anything wrong with his fondness for me. The problem was that there was just too much of it. Not only do I understand that there is nothing I could do to persuade you to commit any grave offense against God, he assured me, but I would never dream of trying. We spoke a great deal about this, but I was so madly in love with God at this time that all I ever wanted to talk about was Him. My passion for God was childlike, and it mystified my friend. Because of his great desire for me, he began to confide in me. His was no small problem. It turns out that this priest had been intimately involved for a number of years with a local woman. Everyone in the village knew about the affair, but he continued to celebrate the Mass anyway. Even though he had lost his honor and his good name, no one dared to denounce him. I felt sorry for this man because I was so fond of him. I was so superficial and blind in those days that I thought it was a virtue to be loyal and grateful to anyone who liked me. Damn such loyalty when it distracts a person from her loyalty to God. This is a common mistake people make in this world, and yet it never ceases to baffle me. Even though it is God to whom we owe gratitude for all good things, we do not hesitate to act against Him while we are reluctant to do anything that might strain our human friendships. O blindness of the world! May it serve you, my beloved, to replace my imperfect appreciation for worldly relationships with unmitigated gratitude for you. But I have exhibited the exact opposite behavior. That's how wicked I am. I started asking around about my priest. That's when I began to realize what deep trouble the poor man had gotten himself into and to see that it was not altogether his fault. It turns out that this wretched woman had cast a spell on him. She gave him a little copper amulet and begged him to wear it around his neck as a symbol of their love. No one had the power to persuade him to take the thing off. Now, I must say I do not believe in the story of bewitchment. I am simply recounting an incident I witnessed as a warning to you men to be on your guard against women like this. Since women in general are more compelled than men to be honest and true, a woman who is willing to sacrifice her virtue is thoroughly untrustworthy. The devil whispers in her ear, inflaming her desire, and off she goes. Such women are willing to shame themselves before God for the pleasure of following their own will. I know I'm not perfect, But I've never tried to manipulate anyone like that. Even if I had the power to force someone's affection for me, I wouldn't want to. Fortunately, God has kept me from making this kind of mistake. If He had abandoned me to my own impulses, however, I might well have done wrong in this regard, as I have in so many others. I'm simply not to be trusted. When I found out about the spell, I began to show this man greater affection. Although my intentions were good, my actions were bad. Bad means, no matter how small, never justify good ends, no matter how great. I mostly spoke to this priest about God. This must have benefited him to some extent, but I believe that his love for me helped him more. To please me, he ended up giving me the copper amulet, and I immediately threw it into the river. After this, the priest was like a man awakening from a dream. As he began to recall everything he had been doing during his years of involvement with that woman, he was shocked and disappointed with himself. He felt loathing for the woman who had led him to his downfall. His intense devotion to the Blessed Mother seemed to have helped him a great deal. The feast day of the Immaculate Conception has always been very important to him. Finally, he cut off the affair once and for all, and he never tired of giving thanks to God for showing him the light. Exactly 1 year after the day I met the priest, he died. He had spent a lifetime actively serving God. I never thought that there was anything incorrect about his affection for me, although it could have been purer. There were times when, if we had not been so close to God, we might have engaged in some serious offenses. But I would not have allowed myself to do anything I thought might lead to mortal sin. I think he realized this, and it made him love me all the more. I believe that all men are attracted to women whom they perceive as being inclined toward virtue. Even women who have no aspirations beyond this world will get more from men by maintaining their integrity. I'll elaborate on this later. I have no doubt that this priest is now on the road to liberation. He died a very holy death, completely free of the errors he had committed. I guess it was the Lord's will for him to be redeemed in this way. I stayed in that village for 3 months. With my delicate constitution, I suffered terribly. I barely survived the radical treatment. At the end of the 2 months, the cure had almost killed me. That pain in my heart, which was the reason I had gone there in the first place, was much worse. Sometimes it felt as if sharp teeth were biting into me. My pain was so intense that the people taking care of me were afraid that I was going to lose my mind. My energy plummeted. I took only liquid because I was nauseated all the time and couldn't bear to eat solid food. I ran a constant fever. They had been giving me purgatives every day for almost a month, and I was wasting away. I was so constricted that my nerves began to shrink, causing me such excruciating pain that I could not sleep day or night. I was utterly miserable. It became apparent to my father that the healer was doing me no good, and he took me away. We went back to the regular doctors, but they had given up on me. They concluded that in addition to all of my other ailments, I was suffering from tuberculosis, and there was nothing they could do for me. This diagnosis did not bother me nearly as much as did the constant pain that racked me from head to foot. The doctors themselves admitted that nerve pain is unbearable. And since my nerves had collapsed, I would indeed have been incapable of enduring the suffering if not for the realization that my condition was of my own making. I battled all of these problems at the same time for more than 3 months. It was excruciating. In retrospect, it seems impossible that I survived. I am equally amazed and also grateful that His Majesty gave me the blessing of great patience. It is clear that this gift came directly from God. Reading the story of Job in the Morals of St. Gregory bolstered my patience tremendously. I even slept with them. The Lord used this text to prepare me for the suffering I had to undergo. It also helped that I had begun to cultivate contemplative practice, because this enabled me to sit with things as they are. All my conversations were with God. I continually carried the words of Job in my mind. Since we have received good things at the hand of the Lord, Shall we not suffer evil things? I repeated this frequently, and it gave me strength. It was time for the August feast of Our Lady. I had been in agony since April, but the last 3 months had been the worst. I had always been inclined to go to confession often, but now I was confessing at every opportunity. They all thought that this was because I was afraid of dying, so my father, thinking he was protecting me from mental distress, decided to forbid me from going anymore. Oh, too much earthly love. My father was a good Catholic and a very wise man, so it was not a matter of ignorance that prevented him from seeing what good the practice of penance had been doing me. Nevertheless, despite his intention, his stance could have done me great harm. That night I had a seizure that left me unconscious for almost 4 days. They administered the sacrament of unction, and from hour to hour and moment to moment, they expected me to die. Over and over they recited the creed to me as if I could understand. At one point, they seemed to conclude that I was dead, because I actually found wax on my eyelids when I regained consciousness. My father was terribly distressed about having prevented me from going to confession. Many tears were shed for me, and many prayers were said to God on my behalf. Blessed be the one who heard them. They dug a grave for me back at the Incarnation and were waiting a day and a half for my body. In another monastery of our order, far away, they had already performed the last rites for me. But it pleased the Lord for me to return to consciousness. I immediately wanted to go to confession. When I received communion, I couldn't stop crying. It was not only that, I was moved and distressed by the possibility that I had in any way offended God. That remorse in itself would have been enough to save my soul. No. What upset me most was the realization that the men who had attempted to guide me had misled me and tried to convince me that my sins were minor, when in fact they had been grave. I now saw clearly that I had used this guidance as an excuse for inexcusable acts. My suffering was so unbearable I could hardly form thoughts. Still, I think I managed to offer a complete confession of all the ways I had forsaken my God. There is a certain blessing, among so many others, that His Majesty has given me. Ever since I first began to speak with Him, I have never kept back anything. If I thought I might have committed any error, even a minor one, I confessed it. But I do believe that if I had died back then without having had access to proper confession, my salvation would have been questionable. This is partly because my spiritual guides were only half-learned men, and also because I myself was such a mess. There were many other reasons as well. When I come to this point in my story, I find myself so stunned to remember how my beloved brought me back to life that I am trembling inside. It seems to me that it would be a good thing, my soul, for you to take a look at the danger from which your Lord delivered you. That way, if love is not enough to keep you from offending Him, you will at least be motivated by awe. There were 1,000 times He might have let you die, and when you were in an even greater state of peril than you found yourself in that day. I do not believe I am exaggerating when I say 1,000. Although the person who has ordered me to tell my life story has repeatedly urged me to be moderate when I recount my sins. But I have already made my transgressions sound far too innocent. For love of God, I beg this man not to excuse a single one of my faults, because they only serve to reveal the magnificence of God and His willingness to suffer for our souls. May He be blessed forever. And may His Majesty be pleased to know that I would swallow myself whole before I would ever stop loving Him.